Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. We're going to give everybody a few seconds as they're being allowed into the room here. I see our numbers going up, so Zoom is still letting people in one by one. And we'll give it another, 20 seconds or so to allow everyone in. Hope everybody's having a great day so far today. Yeah, we have a great topic for you today around Microsoft Azure. So is Azure right for your business? Hopefully we're going to find that all out today. All right, so that should be enough time for everybody to come in. So again, welcome everyone to our webinar today. My name is Michael Sugrue. I'm Chief Revenue Officer and a partner here at Pace Technical. And today I am joined by our CEO, Tyler Sanders.
Good afternoon.
As well as our special guest speaker today, Matt Hache, who's
Great to be here.
Yeah, and Matt is with one of our trusted partners, Pax 8. We utilize them, definitely as a source for reference, and we leverage them for expertise in pretty much everything Microsoft, all the Microsoft products, services, and definitely Azure for sure. So he's got a wealth of knowledge on this topic, which is great. So just super quick before we get going on the webinar, I think most people on this call probably are familiar with us, several of our clients on the call, but if you're not familiar with us, just super quick, we've been in business now a little over 23 years. The primary services, proactive managed IT security, managed cloud services, including our topic today, Microsoft Azure services. We're a little over 60 people in the company, and we're an ISO 9001 certified business. We've been for the last, I think it's 7 going on 8 years now. And for the last 9 years, been a great place to work here in Canada. And a couple of other things of note, we work with a little over 60 law firms, providing them with all of their IT and services. Many of them we do host cloud services with as well, and a little over 70 commercial businesses. The right there is our service model. Look, if we haven't had a conversation recently, love to have an opportunity to talk with your business or firm about how you're using technology and are you, getting the most out of the investment that you're making. Super quick on our model here, like we do all the basic reactive services that every other IT company will do, your help desk, basic maintenance and things like that. But most people want to work with us for the proactive side of our business. Again, if we haven't had a conversation recently about it, maybe certainly hit us up and we'd love to arrange a call. If you've never been on one of these educational webinars that we put out, welcome. If you have, then you probably know that we provide access to all these webinars through our website. If you just go to pacetechnical.com and go to the media dropdown, under resources, you'll see webinars, and you can have on-demand access to any of the previous webinars that we've done. Lots of great topics in there: cybersecurity, Microsoft products, cloud services, etc. So feel free to go in. And then also super quick, little housekeeping. Everybody's in listen-only mode. The webinar is being recorded. Main question that we get, so we will be sending out access to all attendees to be able to go back and access the webinar. Certainly you can ask questions during the webinar. You can use the Q&A button at the bottom and or top, all depending on where it sits in your Zoom. You can also raise your hand during the webinar as well. We're also going to leave some time at the end for questions. And actually, as part of the webinar, I've got some questions that I'm going to want to ask about Azure services. It may be similar questions to what you might want, but hopefully just to open up some specific discussion around Azure in particular. All right. So super quick, we'll just go over the agenda that we have today. First, we're just going to talk about, what is Azure in general. and then move on to some of the benefits of Azure, maybe why Azure versus other private clouds that exist. And then we're going to have that Q&A session with Matt, just talking about some common Azure cloud questions and some other scenarios that I want to ask. And then we're going to open it up to the audience, any kind of questions that you might want to ask. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Matt and hear what he has to say about Azure.
Thank you so much. Nice to be here again. I know we had an opportunity to do this back in 2022, I want to say, and this is always an ongoing conversation and it's worth having again. As mentioned, I am Matthew Hache. I work with Paxe, but I've been in the industry, specifically the Southern Ontario, like MSP space, for coming up to 10 years now at this point, spending a lot of time, design and architecture. So a lot of this stuff has been, just lessons learned over the ages. And this is kind of the relationship and the expertise we bring to Pace and work together to ensure that we're providing best in class. What we're going to look at today is really why cloud services from a fundamental perspective, and then specifically why we want to align onto Azure. Some of the baseline things you'll hear about why cloud services is economies of scale, right? It's something you'll hear quite often. Microsoft, we'll just use, but most cloud providers, especially the big ones, they're going to be doing massive investments, core investments, security investments, anything into the infrastructure to ensure they're able to edge out the competition. What this means for small to medium businesses is you're now getting access to enterprise grade security, efficiencies, even just straight up equipment under the hood for baseline prices. And that's something that really edges out the big three, we'll call them the big three cloud providers, and from a lot of other maybe localized hosters a lot of times. Increased agility is a big one as well. I always hate to bring it back up, but COVID and the lockdowns and having to shift how our entire lives functioned and how we had to maybe shift to a full remote work from home. If you're living in a traditional 5-year, 6-year hardware refresh cycle, a lot of organizations panicked. They didn't have laptops. They couldn't work remote. I recall working at my service provider at the time, and we couldn't get laptops for months, and it was very difficult. So the ability to scale and be agile in your business requirements, whether you're scaling up due to merger or acquisition, whether you're scaling down during lean times, whether there's new line of business applications, you're not locked into anything. Expanding your workforce. When you're in a decentralized or a cloud-based solution, your hiring footprint is now beyond just the GTA and what you can drive to. You can hire contractors, you can hire outside of your geographic region. And that's actually something a lot of high-value talent is looking for right now. They don't want to come into the office if they can avoid it. Cloud solutions put you exactly in the driver's seat to provide that. And as a result, all these kind of cumulative benefits allow you to edge out competition. So this becomes less of a cost center and more of a value add and a differentiator for your businesses. When you're able to provide these internal best-in-class working experiences, means you're going to provide best-in-class experiences for your clients. We'll slip to the next slide. Thanks. But I think it's good to understand, like, what is Azure, right? For years, everyone says the cloud, and it was very ubiquitous in what its terminology would be. But, it's a fancy way to say someone else's computer, right? We are leasing or using someone else's computer in this case. Now, your equipment and your ecosystem running on that is isolated. So you're not sharing, data with somebody else, right? You have a small section of this environment carved out, dedicated for you. And that leans into the economies of scale that we talked about earlier, right? You're not buying a $2 million cluster. You're buying just what you need, and you're using just what you need. Security and compliancy focused. Azure is best in class in this right now. I think for the last 3 years, they've been top right quadrant with Gartner's for security innovations. And they've advertised they're investing almost $4.5 billion just in security in the next 3 years, with another $10 billion marked over the next 10 years. They are very serious about this. And it shows. The US government is officially running DoD level security in Azure. They have dedicated government clouds, and the Canadian government is cloud first, SaaS first, PaaS second, or platforms. And Azure is their cloud of choice where possible. So this, if it's good enough for, the high security, high sec, those same economies of scale bleed down and are available to you at SMB or mid-market level. Extending your familiar architecture. This is an interesting one and often gets overlooked. There are a lot of different cloud providers out there. You got your AWS, you got your Google. But when we look at what our businesses' workloads are right now, like Office, Excel, email, Teams, SharePoint, the things that we're probably living and breathing every day, work natively and better in Azure. So we're extending things that we're used to, and we're just getting better versions of them. A lot of the other organizations and even some private cloud hosters will say, we can do that stuff too, but they're essentially just taking the technologies that Microsoft have perfected, and then they're trying to make them work. Right. And you can get very, very close, but there's a lot of, I don't want to say risk, but if there's a change in the architecture and ecosystem, Microsoft's on the ground floor. They likely constituted and architected that change. So, not to say putting your eggs in one basket, but kind of aligning with the organizations that's providing all your key business tools is a very effective and smart move. We touched a little bit on the industry leading innovation, a little off topic, but of importance. You've probably all seen the word AI at least once in the news cycle. It's dominating everything. Microsoft is industry leads, right, on this. So when we align in a platform or an architecture, while it might not serve your industry right now or even your business at the immediate level, we're setting up the cards, we're setting up the dominoes to be sitting in the best in class provider when AI can make sweeping changes to your business. So there's none of this re-architecting and redesigning things 3 years down the road. We just start activating features and start optimizing your businesses. And the thing is, a lot of you are probably already consuming Azure services and you're not even aware of it. Exchange, your emails, your SharePoints, your Teams, your OneDrive, that's all running on Azure. That is Microsoft's hosting platform for these services. So we're just essentially dipping another toe into the pool by bringing the rest of the infrastructure and architecture in there. We just hop on to the next slide. Excellent. So some of the core benefits of using Azure, we touched on this slightly, but it tends to be more cost effective, which is surprising because a lot of times people, if you've ever looked at Azure, even from MSP standpoints, when they start looking at Azure, it may seem daunting at first. There is a way to approach it versus, say, your traditional architecture and design. And Pace has had a lot of exposure to this at this point. And it's essentially you design for the workload, the immediate workload, not the predicted 5-year workload. So when you start to adjust for the fact that you have agility now available to you, it actually becomes much more cost effective. And that isn't foregoing any security benefits, right, to make that price point happen. That is all kind of table stakes, as we would call them. It's the baseline requirements to start working in this stuff is already included in the price points. Tightly integrated services. We talked about all the other stuff, your Teams, your OneDrive, your SharePoints. Those now just work natively within your architecture, whereas, some workarounds or patches may have had to have occurred in a hosted infrastructure or even on-premise infrastructure. You also are getting access to, best-in-class networking and security and compliancy on the back end as well, protecting assets and areas of attack that are traditionally very difficult for SMBs to protect against, hardware exploits and things like that. This is all handled by Microsoft. The third bullet, small and medium businesses are built on Windows, right? I just kind of think of the person or the situation where I have to go to an accountant being like, you can't use Excel anymore. Like Excel's gone. You got to use whatever this new, spreadsheet application is. They probably strangle me on the spot, right? This is essentially what our industry and almost every industry built their infrastructure on. So just keeping that cadence going, keeping moving with, the winning party. 95% of Fortune 500 companies use Azure, and that's not a fluke, right? While Amazon, AWS, they might tote like they've got, one of the fastest growing clouds, they're very specific in their industries. They are development, right? They're things like Netflix. The thing is, Netflix doesn't run like regular businesses. It's different. When we start looking at the big ones, the Fortune 500s, the Fortune 100s, there's a reason why they've aligned on Azure because it makes sense. It's how they pivot and they build their ecosystems. And the AI drive is really pushing those numbers even further. Modernized technologies will allude to some of these a little bit later, but Azure Virtual Desktops is kind of the modern way to have hosted desktop services. Traditionally, I know Pace has provided Citrix, which is I wouldn't say a legacy, but it's more of a the way we used to have to do things, and it was best in class at the time. And AVD has taken this as a learning and has optimized and modernized well beyond, which is why it's one of the more preferred offerings at this point. For anybody that has an industry compliance, whether it's CMMC, PCI DSS, you can just throw acronyms at you all day. There are compliancy modules. So when you have cybersecurity insurance knocking at your door or certain compliances you're trying to adhere to, it makes it very easy for PACE to be able to provide those reports and those projects to get you to those levels of certifications and compliances. So it gets you one step closer. And then greater return on investment, right? If you're already buying business premium, which is a very, very powerful and common SKU, a lot of the licensing, security, and compliancy modules are already built into that. So we just need to turn them on. So when you land in Azure, it's not rebuying architecture, rebuying licensing. There's no real sunk cost. We're actually just activating more lights on the dashboard. We'll hit the next slide, please. Touched on this a little bit before. Why Azure versus other cloud providers? Big three, private host, whatever the case is. Microsoft, again, industry leading at this point, right? They are heavily investing. They're doubling. They're tripling down in security, compliance, platform. Most of your line of business at this point runs on something provided by Microsoft. If it's applications like PC Law, right? Very popular in the law industry. If it's Sage 300 in the accounting and finance, if it's anything, they're running on Microsoft backplanes, right? SQL. And, so when we start looking at this technology and it's, even the stuff that is not Microsoft is built off Microsoft, we move it into an ecosystem that is more compatible, more synergized with these. So while, yes, you can run this stuff on AWS, it's, picking it up and trying to make it work, whereas it just integrates with Azure. And there's power in that. There's efficiencies. We talked about better integrations. We touched on those. Things like your Teams, your OneDrive, your SharePoint, they will work much better in virtual desktoping compared to, say, maybe other hosted platform services. And when designed and architected correctly, and that's why trusted partners like PACE are important when you make this journey into Azure, you're likely to get more bang for your buck, better performance, and better efficiencies. And that can be something that's very hard to capture sometimes when you're looking, if you're a CFO, CRO, and you're looking at, my cost benefit analysis. If you're looking at a server and you're looking at Azure, the ROI was, well, clearly the server is better. At 3 years, we break even. But what doesn't get seen is when everyone has to drive into the office, we have all this extra security requirements behind the scenes that we now have to adhere to. And it kind of gets lost in the weeds. So when you're looking at Azure and you're evaluating it for your business, it very much becomes a value proposition and not a cash proposition. That being said, we don't want you to lose your shirt just to be in Azure. So part of those assessments that PACE runs and that we help them with is Azure a fit for you, right? I think we'll talk about this maybe later in a more natural sense. Mm-hmm. But, from my time working with PACE, they are not going to put a square peg in a round hole. Right? They need to make sure that the solutions they are providing is the best interest of your organization. So we'll talk about that a little bit more.
Exactly. If I can just add one other thing that we certainly see in the marketplace as well, and certainly within our industry, historically for private cloud services, it was generally companies like us, MSPs like PACE, or the hundreds of others that are available out there. And one of the advantages to going to Azure versus working in a private cloud with a private company like ours is if you ever decide you don't like us and don't want to work with, say, PACE anymore, and you happen to be in our private cloud, in order for you to move away from us, somebody has to recreate that whole environment somewhere else and do a big migration project to be able to move you. And I think a lot of people are migrating towards solutions like Azure, as if you decided you hated PACE and you were in Azure for all of your hosted services, it's literally just changing the account management name of who is helping manage your instance of Azure. You don't have to pick up and move data or recreate the wheel. It's one of the other benefits, I suppose.
I think that speaks a lot to PACE as well, because this could be perceived as a risk. I know some organizations that don't want to adopt this fluidity or this technology because they're worried about losing their stickiness. Like forcing someone into their ecosystem is the only way they're maintaining clients. It speaks a lot to PACE for adopting the solution because they are confident the managed services and everything they provide will more than guarantee the value. So, when you're trying to align to a partner, taking what could be perceived as a client flight risk confidently is something that should be, taken into account.
Yeah. Well, at the end of the day, we all have to remember the cloud is a tool, just like any other tool. It's like antivirus. Like you don't choose your service provider based on one particular tool that they're going to use. You choose a managed service provider based on the organization that you trust the most to make sure that they're going to be looking after your business proactively, making sure you're set up and configured the right way, make sure you're as secure as you possibly can. I'll tell you, and everybody on the call right now, every one of the hundreds of other IT service companies can get you into a cloud, but that's not what's going to predict what kind of environment and what kind of experience that you're going to have with your technology. It's going to be how it's managed, because there's a whole lot more to it.
Yep, it is earning your business every day, right? That's what it comes down to, and that's what you expect from a trusted partner. So
yeah,
excellent.
Okay.
So I think this is kind of the open Q&A section. We
it is.
Azure is a beast in its own. I'm sure there's probably some questions, but if you kind of wanted to kick us off, I know like you said, you had some softballs for me.
Well, we'll see if you consider them how much how good a softballs. But let's just start out with a general one. Like, what sort of industries do you find are adopting Azure in Canada?
Yeah, so the Canadian market's been a very interesting one. We've, traditionally we've been very slow to adopt technology, and not to bring back COVID, the acceleration that caused really kind of shone a light. Some of the more faster to adopt, specifically, has been law firms and finance. We found that once we couldn't get into the office and still needed to work, especially those highly consultative roles, they needed the ability to not lose an hour of time because it directly hit their bottom line. So immediately once the pressure was down, they saw the value. So I would say probably a majority of my conversations or organizations that, I brought up PC law, but like law firms, I probably 1 in every 2 or 3 calls I run is a law firm, and the other 1 in 3 is going to be finance and accountants, right? Whether they're large firms, small firms, mom and pop shops, they're all seeing the value in this.
Matt, correct me if I'm wrong. One of the things I've noticed over the years and why we didn't really adopt Azure in our client base, let's call it 5 or more years ago, is it was cost prohibitive, let's say, in the way that just Azure, AWS, these big public clouds, they structured their pricing model, really, was more focused, I guess, on enterprise, the larger organizations. Yeah. It seems to me that Microsoft has done a much better job, perhaps, than the others in making this more, reducing that barrier by being more cost effective for the SMB market and being able to scale a little better.
Yeah, I think, Microsoft, and really this is kind of the industry as a whole, was don't worry, go into cloud, just use it, you'll be fine. And then, every organization turns around and be like, hey, this is like 5 times more expensive than we thought. And it kind of created this inward glance of, is this the right move? Is this the right solution? And especially as, industry started to dial back with, layoffs and things like that, there's been a very focal eye on Azure and Azure Cloud in general. What we tend to find is that, if you align yourself with the wrong partner or the wrong sort of solution design, you tend to build them like you were traditional infrastructure. And I kind of alluded to that at the top of the call. In a previous life, when I worked for a service provider, when we were deciding how much hardware to assign, whether it's in a hosted option or what they were buying on-prem, we tried to predict a 5-year life cycle. Where could your industry be in 5 years? So you over provision, you overbuild. So you might do 2 or 3 extra amount of storage. Well, a lot of industries and a lot of service providers took that information and tried to recreate that in Azure, tripling their costs. So part of it was, Microsoft's lack of, education, industry experience and things like that. But what we then started to see is when we take the iterative sprint at like a 6-month, like where are you in the next 6? How are things going? And this is, again, back to the trusted partner, someone that will do that for you and actually monitor this stuff is important. We started to see the pricing come more in line. And again, it comes back down to a value conversation too, because it's still never going to beat having a rusty box in the closet until it dies, right? You can run that as long as you want, not recommended, but there's nothing stopping you. So, when we start looking at the value proposition and, the agility, that started to drive that more into the hands of SMB and mid-market.
And I think that was a little misleading. The marketing in the beginning of some of the bigger clouds was, hey, save money by going to cloud. And it didn't, usually in the SMB space, especially, it didn't work out that way.
There's an entire industry I would probably say in the last 3 to 4 years that sprung up around this to just cost optimize Fortune 500 cloud spends. Because they just kind of got a blank check and no one really tied it back. This is a problem that exists with all businesses, is like, we put the money, but are we seeing the ROI? And once they realized they had no way to track it, they kind of backpedaled. So, taking it cautiously, but taking it, with a gleam and hope in our eyes and just excited to see what comes up is definitely an approach to Azure, is the way I approach it.
Yeah, I use the analogy of it's almost like a utilities, consumption-based marketing or consumption rather. And it's like having a programmable thermostat, right? And when you're not using it, you don't have the heat turned on in the winter, and when you need it, you use it, and you can really tune Azure to be more of that consumption-based model and control your costs a little better by peaks and slowdowns in your usage.
Yeah, you can leave all the lights in your house on, so it's convenient when you walk into the room. You don't have to reach for the light switch, but then at the end of the month, you pay for that. So,
All right. Yeah. Okay, I've got another question here. What sort of advancements could somebody moving from, let's say, a traditional or like an on-premise infrastructure or even a hosted solution, what could they expect moving to Azure? Yeah,
so there are slight architectural design changes when you move in. There's, not to get too technical, there's the ability to separate certain feature sets from others to kind of relieve barriers or kind of bottlenecks. So if we're looking at virtual desktoping, the ability to log into a computer in the cloud. If we're looking at, say, just like a traditional on-premise where I log onto my laptop and I can only move as fast as the hard drive, right, spins in my system, or if it's an SSD communicates. When you move into Azure, some of the architectural decisions, the design is to take the profile, the user experience, and remove that from overarching performance, and then providing it its own scalable, burstable performance loads. This is really how you start to see the economies of scale come in. So what you may have taken, 5 or 10 minutes to load a massive macro heavy Excel file can be done in, 15, 20 seconds as an example. And what it'll do is you can burst out. If you have a very busy period, if you have a large case where suddenly you need to store 4K video files or massive documents, you don't have to go and spend $10,000 on a SAN. You can just turn around and open the space up for as you need it. And when the case is closed, archive it into some cold tiering. You have agility and no sunk cost when you move into these platforms and services. But even just some of the additional things like the virtual desktoping, the platform services, the compliance reports, this stuff doesn't exist natively on premise, right? Third-party tools, third-party systems, additional programs, and all this stuff needed to be purchased, maintained, patched, added to their own compliancy cycles. This is all kind of monitored centrally in Azure. And then as a result, it allows partners like Pace to focus on what's important, as opposed to, well, let's check this dashboard. Let's go to this dashboard. Let's look at this one. So there are benefits for both sides. We do have a question actually in the Q&A from Alvin, is how does Azure differ from Active Directory? Two different platforms, right? But the thing is, Active Directory is, for case in point, a directory or an identity service. So what that is, when you log in, who's holding the keys, the username and passwords, and subsequently multi-factor authentication. So Azure works on Active Directory. They've rebranded it to Entra. For anyone who's getting technical and looking for this stuff and getting confused, there's Entra ID and Entra Domain Services. So they work together. They have the ability to either synergize together or be able to migrate from one to the other based on the best business case for the organization.
Okay. Another question I had, I'm not sure if we maybe answered it already, partially at least. What's the number one driving factor for Azure adoption?
Right. Picking one is going to be slightly tougher, but I would say security is probably one of the biggest in the forefront. It's even the last 3 or 4 years in the industry, everything is security first, which is fantastic because it used to be just, cost first. So obviously there are costs for security. And when we start to look at the economies of scale and what's being provided in Azure, bang for a buck really speaks volumes up there. We'll just use an example. Business Premium, right? The probably one of the more popular SKUs provides you not only your Office licensing, your Exchange, your Teams, your SharePoint, all that fun stuff, but also comes with technologies that we can leverage like conditional access or multi-factor authentication. So when you move this data and this environment into Azure, because it's all in the same ecosystem, those security modules just kind of sweep over everything. Mm-hmm. When you have things in other data centers or you have things on premise, the security modules and compliancy stuff just kind of stop at the edge. So your multi-factor authentication now needs to be a third-party tool or appliance. So we're finding a lot of organizations when they have to worry about data loss, retention, data immutability. I know that's a very big thing in law firms, right? Keeping data for 7 years due to compliancy. These are things that can be enforced, and you don't have to worry about someone coming in and just walking out with the equipment, right? This is now in like DoD level data centers with data residency as well. This is something I keep saying DoD, and I know that's US based, but we have data centers in Canada with geo redundancies to other regions, and the data does not leave Canada. So that is very important to a lot of organizations, especially in sort of legal, law, healthcare, and accounts. So I'd say security is one, and just convenience number two, right? Like I can right now log into a virtual desktop on my cell phone and plug a keyboard into it and a monitor, and anywhere in the world log into a secure desktop. I could go to the airport or a library and securely log in. And when I'm done, just log out, and no one's taking my data at that point. It stays containerized, doesn't leave the ecosystem. It's very, very important when we talk about this stuff, especially for convenience.
Mm-hmm. All right. So it looks like a couple of other questions have come in. So First one is Azure compatible with any document management systems, or does Azure have their own DMS?
Right. So I would say yes, almost every document management system, right? If it runs on a Windows, because that's the thing is Azure is just it can be as platformed as you want it to be. It could just be a way to host Windows operating systems. So if it installs in a traditional environment, it isn't some very highly customized, it needs to run out of someone's private data center solution, I'll say yes, it'll run in Azure, and probably better than you would expect. Does it have its own document management system? No, right? So Microsoft will provide like Marketplace. So, I've seen products like Ignite and things like that come in that can provide document management. I'll caveat, I've never seen it live. I can't speak to its efficacy, but understanding that if it can be installed on premise, it can be installed in Azure, right? So I'll say yes, star. Looks like we got another one there.
Yeah, and this one actually sort of dovetails into another question that I had. So this question here is, instead of Azure, can I just use SharePoint as my cloud server? And the question that I was going to ask is, what if an SMB just runs all web-based applications? They don't have a need to run something specifically on a server, then what role does Azure play there? But maybe both can be.
Yeah. So to your point, they're tied together. What you'll find a lot of times is, when you look at the workload of an organization, having someone actually assess the workload is very important. It is very tempting just to throw everything into SharePoint, because while it can do a lot of that stuff, there are some hard limitations to that platform that a lot of SMBs and businesses fall into. If your general workload is just Office files, right? Excel, Word, PDF, things like that, and the data size is of a reasonable quantity, SharePoint is a perfect solution, right? But SharePoint is not a file service. It is a collaboration tool and really should be treated as such. And the reason why I say that, at a certain point, if you run out of space, it can be extremely cost prohibitive to buy more space in Azure, in SharePoint, to the point where I have organizations running massive $100,000 projects to get out of SharePoint into Azure because they're hitting hard limitations, right? If you're looking at organizations that are dealing with large data files, video recordings, and things like that, we will see a diversification where their office and collaboration documents are in SharePoint, and then those large storage files or things like that live in Azure. AutoCAD design, it's very difficult and problematic to put that into SharePoint because it doesn't handle those files the same way. So part of the assessment for SMBs is what makes the most sense. Pace isn't going to put you into Azure just to make a number, right? Just because it's what they know. They're going to assess SharePoint as a solution and alternative. If you have no server requirements, it's probably the first thing and probably the best place to end up, because then you've lowered your attack vector. But back to the square peg round hole thing, they're going to recommend Azure when it makes sense for your organization. And if it's declined and you end up in SharePoint, your experience could be less than ideal and actually be at risk of data loss because of the way SharePoint handles file synchronizations and the types of files and how it collaborates. So I would say yes star, no star, right? Very situational, but there is a clear path to identify whether this makes sense for an organization or not.
And just that's great, Matt. And just to elaborate on it too, like another tied in question. So we're seeing a lot of law firms now or businesses, they're running primarily web-based applications or just exclusively web-based applications. Want to get they don't necessarily fit the requirements of where do they put their files. So maybe they can get the files into OneDrive and SharePoint. Does Azure then, is there any role that Azure can play in that type of environment from a security control perspective or?
Yeah. So there are tools, and we'll call them like knobs and switches you can turn on in Azure. And this is where it kind of gets really in the weeds, but like Office 365, Active Directory, Azure, they all kind of live in this weird Venn diagram. So in Azure, you can turn on your compliancy and security, and then that can monitor the other side, your Office 365, ensuring that those are compliant. And vice versa, you can use like sensitivity tagging and labeling and data loss prevention policies on the Office 365 side to protect your Azure stuff. So one of the more common use cases we'll see in a situation presented as such, your active, we'll just use law firms as an example, your active cases and collaboration exist in SharePoint, which means your teams are working, you have a document, everything's good. Upon case closure, you have a retention requirement of say 7 years to keep these things online. What we may see at that point is a move from the data from SharePoint into say a cold or an archive storage in Azure. And the reason why a move like that would be beneficial is one, it keeps your workspace clean, right? And that's just fantastic. But two, then your compliancy, your security, your data loss, your vault immutability, all that stuff becomes something your legal holds that you can action on the other side, which means you can hit all your compliancy regulations, you can hit your data requirement regulations, protections from things like ransomware, theft, deletion, all this stuff can then be actioned on the other side. So I think this is very important, right? And that's really comes down to assessing or understanding the workloads. But, going back to the agility thing, even if it's, maybe we start in SharePoint and our business requirement change, maybe we can't use this cloud app anymore. Maybe we need to start hosting things internally, right? Maybe we need this new line of business application. There is no SaaS version of it. That's fine. Azure is already there, right? We just turn it on, connect the architecture, and you move on. There's no massive, hardware purchase, acquisition, upfront CapEx investment. We just start the timer, right? Start the meter and you start consuming and you grow into the environment. So, some of the advantages in the agility we spoke to.
Right.
There's another one. I don't know if it's somewhat related to that same topic. So what if the SMB, they have servers in the office that they want to get rid of? Will they need a file server in Azure? I guess SharePoint is possibly an option there. Yep.
So that's where, there's a dive-in assessment where we ask, like, what's their line of business application? What are we doing right now, right? A lot of SMBs, the natural growth as we start off 1, 2, 3 computers, we eventually get big enough that managing it in a work group is just not sustainable. So we install a server, an identity server, Active Directory. And then that Active Directory hums along for 15, 20 years, right? As it gets upgraded and moved on to new hardware. Technology's changed though, right? You can use the hosted Entra ID or Azure Active Directory services for centralized or decentralized management at this point. So when you look at the workload in the server, the question's always asked, what's running on it? What's it doing? And if the answer is hosting just Word files and how people log in and authenticate, that thing's gone, right? We don't lift it into Azure. We move you to platform services. We provide you secured sign-on, multi-factor authentication, and decouple your devices from the server in the background. Now, if we're looking at that and 99% of it can be done, but they run QuickBooks, something like QuickBooks or like Sage 50, suddenly server architecture is required because those things don't work very well over the internet or VPN. So we would approach that as maybe a tiny environment as opposed to having a massive environment for everybody. Maybe we spin up just a small server and virtual desktop for the account firm, for the accountant, 2 users log in. So suddenly your capital investment would be $20,000, $30,000 to maybe $200 a month, right? Just pulling numbers out, right? We look and we cater the cloud design to your business. So,
Okay.
got a question.
Another question just came in. Yeah. So, yeah, once you store data, is it possible to retrieve it again? And if yes, how many times can you go through this process of data storage and data retrieval? I'm assuming they're probably talking about like the example you were talking about, the archive solution.
The referencing the stuff. So again, not to get too far into the weeds, there are flavors of this storage, right? The cheapest one is kind of an archive or a cold storage, and just treat it like when you ask for it, someone has to go and put the tape in or put the drive in. You know, it's not a tape, but plug it in and rehydrate the data. It could take up to 24 hours, but you can pay to accelerate it. I don't see that one used too often because of the convenience factor. So there are tiers where it can be a little bit easier for you to access. So, for a slight amount more, and this is the value and what's important to you, you could have a mapped drive, similar to probably what you're expecting right now. And it could be Z archive. And you can read and write that as much as you want. But this is part of the qualification. On the cold storage and the cool storage, there are charges for pulling that data consistently. So if it's actively being worked on, either the process is to move it back into a production workload area or upgrade the storage tiers that it lives on to avoid kind of these accumulating charges. You can access that and do whatever you want as many times as you want. But there is a meter running, right? Any data that's removed from Azure. So if you're just accessing it and looking at it using virtual desktop, it's fine. But if you're taking the data and you're pulling it down to a local drive, a local storage, there's an outbound cost for these items. So you can access it as much as you want, but part of working with a partner is to identify the actual use of the workload. What do you expect? Do you anticipate frequent access? Do we need to make this easier to get to? Or is it something that you can toss a ticket in, wait a couple of days for Pace to get it back to you, right? What is important? Protection and security on that one is generally like the first request and requirement. And those either solution, you will have that. The next question is, how convenient do you want it to be? And how frequently do you think you'll access that? And then that kind of, plinkos the design decision down to where you need to end up.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I only have 1 or 2 other questions. So if anybody in the audience has any more questions, go ahead and use the Q&A and keep firing away. Yeah. Okay, great. Alvin, probably more of a comment that he's going to schedule a meeting to assess if Azure is a good fit for his office. So thank you for that, Alvin. So one of the other questions that I had, and we've partially answered it maybe, is that, what if the SMB needs a virtual desktop? But maybe to use this to just talk a little bit more about what is the experience like for that everyday user if they are utilizing AVD, Azure Virtual Desktop.
Right. So if you're coming from a previous hosted environment, right, like a remote desktop or a Citrix, it'll be very, very similar. You will, start your day, you log in with your credentials, and then it loads a desktop that looks exactly like the desktop you're working on right now locally. It'll be Windows 10 or Windows 11. It'll have all your line of business applications. One of the biggest advantages, though, is when you close that desktop and maybe travel to another computer. So like you don't have to have your own desktops now. You could have unified or universal desktops, and you log back in, everything is there as you expect it. So your general experience and exposure to this kind of stuff will be the same across the board. You have a unique unique to you, but unified experience across any device you log into. This also actually is really interesting for people that love Macs, or, you know, just like don't want to buy and invest in hardware for no reason anymore. You can get a little bit more out of your local assets as long as they're maintaining security patching. You can, you know, connect to systems that maybe aren't validated on the network and still have a secured kind of connection into your environment. So the general experience is either equivalent or better than what you're probably experiencing in any currently hosted solution, because you're going to get proper Windows desktop experience, not server as a desktop experience. And we kind of alluded to those platform services working better, like OneDrive and Teams and things like that. So you'll notice in virtual desktoping, likely better performance on Teams than any other hosted provider, because they have the ability to integrate it tighter into the underground services and actually pass some of the video and audio out of the AVD environment under the local system, offloading some of the pressure. And what that ends up doing is it makes it look like you're running Teams in Azure, but it's actually running local to your system. And it works so well. I've got a lot of partners running massive call centers in Azure, which is something that no one would have considered with other cloud providers because they're worried about the latency over the line. But because of this pass-through technology that is pioneered and unique to Microsoft, you're able to leverage these economies of scale and these already invested platforms through Business Premium to just start doing Teams. And it can be call plans, anything you want. So we're seeing more aggregation into the platform, which is fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's something we've seen with our client base a lot too, Matt, is the fact that a lot of legal applications aren't yet web-based. There's a lot of legacy applications difficult to get off of. So they do require server-hosted infrastructure, virtual desktop.
Right.
And historically, those worked quite well. And then, of course, this big shift in the way that people work after COVID, and a lot more video conferencing, a lot more multimedia. There was Citrix started to do a little better, well, a lot better actually probably than remote desktop did, but I know Microsoft has been putting a lot of attention into the Azure virtual desktop to improve that more even over than what Citrix was able to do.
Yeah. So some crazy advancements in that. 4 years ago, I wouldn't have believed it. I'd still be running Teams calls locally, but you know, I've hopped onto calls with partners and they're like, yeah, I'm on my virtual desktop right now and can't even tell. Right. It's just, it's seamless. It will do 8K video across 8 monitors if you want it to. It is incredible the amount it can push out.
Yeah. So really the last question that I had to bring up, I mean, some of it has been answered maybe, but you know, if I move into Azure, you know, is my data safe? And also, is it local? A lot of the clients that we work with 100% have that requirement to keep data within Canada.
Right. So, is it safe? Yeah, but you know, this is not a one-person job, right? Data security in general is everyone, right? They will provide you best-in-class tools, compliancy, but if you're not doing your due diligence, both pace and the client, right? Like if you can have the best alarm system in the world, but if you don't turn it on and you leave the front door open, like it's not going to matter. Right. So, you know, everything from ensuring that, you know, proper patching is done, best in class architecture is done up front, security, EDR, but even like your end user education. There was, you know, anecdotally, there was a major pushback when like multi-factor authentication started coming onto the field, and, you know, it's too inconvenient. I don't want to do it anymore. And then people started getting hacked left and right. And suddenly it became a mandatory requirement and everyone now needs to do it. Right. And there are still people doing pushback on that. And it is something that, you know, you can't do anymore. Convenience cannot trump security. So yes, your data is safe. All the tools, all the encryptions, all the restore processes, the vault immutabilities, the data loss prevention, the sensitivity labeling is there. It's ready to go. In fact, a lot of you already have it. It just probably needs to be activated and integrated into your systems, right? If, you know, with Business Premium and once your data is in Azure. So yes, it is safe. And then is your data local? Yeah, right. So if we're deploying in Canada Central is based in the GTA, right? The data centers, I think, are on 151 Front and King. I believe they don't actually tell you exactly where they are for security reasons, but there are massive Azure data centers in Toronto. I could drive them if I knew where they were. And then our sister location essentially is Canada East, which is out in Quebec. So you hit your distance compliancy laws. It's over 100 miles or 200 kilometers away. So in the event of blast radius, it will be protected if desired. If that compliancy, geo restrictions or geo redundancy isn't required, you can do localized redundancy, where within the data center, there's numerous copies across isolated pods. So, it's going to be as safe as it's going to get. The tools there is going to make, short of taking it offline and hiding it in a closet somewhere, right? And even then, someone will steal that thing. But when we're talking about the tools made available, they've got the best in class ones to protect the data. But it is an ongoing effort, and it's both an engagement from Azure, from Pace, and from the client. They are all responsible parties in this.
All right. That's all good stuff. And those are the only questions that I have. I don't see any open questions. If anybody had any last minute items they wanted to add in, they could go ahead and do that now. I'm just going to bring up our contact information while we're doing that. And certainly if there's some, questions that people had after the fact, and you can always just email us, the email address there, inquiries@pacetechnical.com. You could call us, any way that you might want to contact us. So, and that is it. So, hey, I want to thank my co-host Tyler, and really want a big thanks to Matt Hache for his expertise and everything that he brought to us today. Thank you again, Matt.
Yeah, thanks,
Absolute
Matt. That was
pleasure.
great.
Not a problem.
Yeah. And with that, we will let everybody back to their days today, and wishing everybody a fantastic day and fantastic rest of the week.
8 Celsius, can't complain.
That's right.
Go for a walk, I think.
We're very lucky.
Very much so. All right.
Yeah. Okay. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks,
Take
everyone.
care.